the Blackhawk, right in the type certificate for the civilian conversion, it states that the aircraft can only be used for, can only be eligible for restricted certificate of airworthiness. And then it goes on to specify that it can't be used for commercial operation, it can't be used for passenger operation, and I believe the other is, well, it's an operational rule that it can't be used for operation in built-up areas. There are a few others, I believe, as well, but the point being, when you get into it, unless you go right back to square one with complete certification basis analysis and assessment and show compliance and show how it meets, there will be the state of design will impose restrictions on the type certificate, and those restrictions most likely will have implications on what the aircraft can be used for.
Hi everyone, I'm Annalisa from C.A.C. Global Solutions. Welcome to our YouTube channel and welcome to another episode of Storytime with Bret, where I talk with Bret about events and experiences that he had during his career as an aircraft maintenance engineer, aviation consultant, and Civil Aviation Authority airworthiness inspector. So welcome, Bret. And what do we talk about today?
Thanks, Annalisa. Today, I'd like to talk about some interesting projects that I've come across both in industry and as a civil aviation inspector regarding military aircraft or ex-military aircraft being used in civilian service in the civil aviation world. So I've got three different examples of aircraft or types of aircraft that I've either been involved in or I've seen come through and come onto civil aviation registers, and some that people had intended on bringing them onto a register, but they just never made it. So I've got three examples of types that I'd like to just kind of go over a little bit, and you'll see very clearly from the three examples that there are a multitude of different ways that an aircraft can come onto a register. There is no one size fits all. Every aircraft that you would want to bring onto a civil aviation register is a project in its own. You would have to discuss that with the authority for the state in which you plan on bringing the aircraft into, right? I've got a Bell 412 helicopter, okay? And this is probably the easiest route that you can get. And that is, to bring an aircraft onto a civil aviation register, there has to be a certification basis that's accepted by the authority. Okay. Now, the whole thing about military aircraft is there may not be a civilian recognized certification basis that the aircraft was certified to begin with. So in other words, it might be that the aircraft were developed to military specs or to a type certificate, military type certificate of sorts that in some instances, you know, the information may be proprietary, might be military secret and can't be shared with civilian service. So there are so many different aspects that you have to consider in these things. The first one, the Bell 412. So the easiest route is where the current type certificate holder of a civilian type certificate has gone through the exercise of assessing the military type aircraft and putting together an application to have that military type added to the type certificate. Now, when they do that, they have to perform a full assessment as to how it meets the given standards that type certificate was based on. So in this case, with the Bell 412 helicopter, Bell Helicopters went through the exercise. They're the type certificate holder. They have all of the information for the construction of these helicopters, both military and civilian. So it was relatively simple for them. And I say relatively because it would be no small project, but it would be relatively simple for them because they hold all of the data for both type, civilian and military, to do a comparison, to produce documents that would substantiate what needed to be done to the aircraft in order to convert it from military into civilian use. The problem is once you designate it as a military aircraft, it no longer conforms to the civilian type certificate. Okay.
Right.
And beyond that as well, while it's in military use, like these aircraft probably have a military life of 10, 12, 20 years, whatever the case might, the given military might designate. In that period, there may be repairs that were done, there may be modifications that were done to the aircraft, and none of these would conform to, for instance, for this type of helicopter to FAR 529. So for that, when you want to bring it back into civilian use, of course, the aircraft has to meet type. It has to meet the standard 529. So anything that was done to the aircraft or the military use, either whether it be from manufacturer to a different specification, or whether it be in-field repairs or modifications, those would all have to be either removed or substantiated to be back to the airworthiness manual or the FAR 529 standard. And see, there are a couple aspects to this. So typically, type certificate data sheets have serial number effectivity. So these aircraft that were produced for military, the serial numbers for those aircraft will not show up on the civilian type certificate. So before the aircraft can be used in civilian use, of course, the serial number has to appear on the civilian type certificate. And the only way that can happen is if the type certificate holder does an assessment, determines what needs to be done to the aircraft to bring it into that type. And then when they define that, they can add it to the type certificate. And then it's up to the person that wants to bring the aircraft onto the register to make sure that it meets that type before it's eligible for a certificate of airworthiness or some other flight authority. So in this case, because Bell had all of the information, they produced documents, internal documents that they lay out in their civilian type certificate that tell you what needs to be done to the aircraft to make it a civilian aircraft again. And again, that requires the operator's assessment of what mods have been incorporated, and it's up to them to determine whether they need to be removed or whether they can be conformed to type. So that's a very simple one, because to bring an aircraft on the register, it has to be type certified, and eligibility has to be established on the type certificate. And so that part's all been done, and what needs to bring it into compliance or conformity, that's all been done as well. So that's about as easy as you can get bringing a military aircraft onto civilian register.
So I imagine the problem with using a military aircraft in the civil aviation, I suspect is because, well, aside for equipment that might be specifically just for military, which you would have to remove them, obviously, and it might be easy or not, depending on the equipment, I suspect. I think the biggest issue that they might have is that a military aircraft may perform in a different envelope, so they don't know what kind of loads exactly the military aircraft was subjected to. I suspect that it's very difficult. So that causes, that means that it's going to be very difficult to understand the life, the remaining lifespan of the aircraft, depending on the loads that the aircraft encountered during its life, I suppose.
For sure. So with the civilian type certificate, of course, you've got airplane flight manuals and rotorcraft flight manuals, whatever the case might be. And in those, you've got envelopes in which the aircraft will be operated. You've got performance specifications for speeds, weights that can be carried, the forces that the aircraft can be subject to. And those are all within an envelope that meets the given standard. In this case would be 529. Now, in the instance of another type of aircraft, I mean, with the 412, in all likelihood, it's been operated within the same envelope for civilian purposes as it would be for military purposes. Now, that's, I mean, you can't say that that statement would be true for all aircraft, because it might be that one of the things that the military wanted to do was operate it at a heavier weight, for instance. But now, Bell, for a civilian aircraft, using the envelope that they provide, that would dictate to them the life of the airframe, the life of different components, the stresses that they would be subject to, and the list goes on and on. Whereas in military service, even if it's something as simple as carrying an extra 1,000 pounds above the normal envelope for a civilian aircraft, that may have an impact on the life of the airframe, for instance. And that's one of the considerations that the type certificate holder has to take into account when they bring the aircraft, or when they allow the aircraft to be, or actually when they make application to the state of design authority to have the aircraft added to the type certificate. So absolutely, and I mean, there we're just talking about the potential of changing weights or whatever, and this is pertinent to typically aircraft that are used in a relatively normal role as they would be in civilian use, right? But then, another example that we have is it's a very popular one these days, it seems, is the Sikorsky Blackhawk. Now, this is an aircraft that can be used and was designed to be used in a military role. The U.S. military, I believe, was involved in the specifications for this aircraft. It can be used and is quite often used in a combat role. It's equipped with armaments and all kinds of other things. So now, not only are we talking about, in an emergency situation, they may load up the aircraft beyond whatever the specification is just to get it off the ground, because they're trying to get troops or whatever, civilians in a disaster recovery situation out of danger, out of harm's way. So they could potentially regularly or somewhat regularly exceed the parameters of the aircraft, right? In a combat situation, they may be the aircraft might be subject to forces beyond what a civilian aircraft would normally be subject to, right? So, and this goes back to the design standard. So the design standard for this type of aircraft in a civilian situation would also be FAR 529. This aircraft may not meet FAR 529 because you have to remember the standard is designed for a level of safety for civilian use. Now, with military, they dictate to some degree, they have their own definitions on what is an acceptable extreme for an aircraft, for instance. And the problem with the Blackhawk is there are very few civilian type certificates for the aircraft. See, Sikorsky doesn't offer doesn't include the Blackhawk on their civilian type certificate. They just don't. Now, whether that's because doing the exercise of putting an aircraft onto the type certificate is an extremely arduous and expensive process, and there's nobody to support it. It could be, I've heard tell that, some of the design features that went into that aircraft are basically military secrets. And so that certain things can't be divulged to civilian population because those aircraft are still in use as well, right? They're still in production, still in use. So there are different aspects as to why it's so difficult to simply put them onto a civilian type certificate. But there is one company that did it, I was looking at, and it's quite interesting because the exercise that they would have had to go through, it's a certification exercise right from the very beginning. Because you have to remember, if you're the original type certificate holder for the aircraft, like Sikorsky, where they have all of the data that was used to produce the aircraft on hand, that makes it so much easier to do an assessment of where the aircraft is, what each one was designed for, and what the specification was, and what the difference is, and what they need to do to get back to that. Whereas If you're a third party and you're proposing a type certificate using this airframe, now all of a sudden you don't necessarily have access to all of that data. Like I said, some of it may be military proprietary, where it can't be shared with civilian population. So you're up against a number of restrictions in that instance.
I find all this interesting because we know there are a few operators in Canada who actually is using the Blackhawk for specific missions. So, the fact that there might be some design concepts applied to their aircraft that are specifically military and they don't want to divulge, well, once an operator has the Blackhawk, they can open it up and look what's what.
Well, you can open it up and see, if what changes have been made or whatever, but you can't determine what forces the aircraft might have been subjected to,
sure,
which may have a detriment on the life of the aircraft. And in doing so, it's not potentially that you can't use the aircraft, but it may be restricted in the role that you're allowed to use it in.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, in the case of the Blackhawk, in the case of the 412, there are no restrictions. Once it enters into civilian use, it's just like it always was a civilian 412 aircraft and can be used for whatever a normal one that was produced for civilian use is. In the case of the Blackhawk, it's not eligible for a standard certificate of airworthiness, which has a couple different implications. So with the 412, it is eligible for a standard C of A because it's type certified. With the Blackhawk, right in the type certificate for the civilian conversion, it states that the aircraft can only be eligible for a restricted certificate of airworthiness. And then it goes on to specify that it can't be used for commercial operation, it can't be used for passenger operation, and I believe the other is, it's an operational rule that it can't be used for operation in built-up areas. There are a few others, I believe, as well. But the point being, when you get into it, unless you go right back to square one with complete certification basis analysis and assessment and show compliance and show how it meets, there will be the state of design will impose restrictions on the type certificate, and those restrictions most likely will have implications on what the aircraft can be used for. And we've seen this, and I've come across it firsthand as well. When I was in the Cayman Islands, there was an operator that wanted to bring in a Blackhawk, and we were entertaining it, but it was the same old story. Show us type certification of some sort before we can even really have the conversation. And the operator went away and they figured out that it was going to be cost prohibitive to do so. So we never really heard back from them. I don't know what the full story was, and I don't really want to comment on it. But the point being, the exercise can be so restrictive, so labor and cost intensive, that it becomes cost prohibitive. And then even like with the Blackhawks that are in Canada right now, Transport Canada, because they're a restricted certificate of airworthiness, they can't be used in civilian service or for commercial service rather. They can only be used for specific aerial work, with the limitations of no passengers, and they can't be used in the commercial use and such. So that really restricts. You can bring an aircraft in, you can get a certificate of airworthiness for it, but what can you do with it once you have that? It's kind of is it really worth the effort? And this is one piece where I think everybody has to be extremely aware of, is when you start thinking about an endeavor like this, you have to engage the authorities right up front and get their position on things, because you can end up spending $1 million or a couple $1 million, bring the aircraft in and not be able to do what you want with it. Then it kind of becomes somewhat worthless.
Yeah. So I'm curious, when you mentioned that if you want to have a version, full civilian version, so a civilian TCDS, and you have to go through the exercise. Can you talk a little bit about what exactly this exercise would look like? I mean, I know we're not expert in this military civilian conversion, but we can, I think we can comment a little bit on this.
Well, just, I mean, for instance, it all starts with state of design. Okay, so first there has to be a civilian type certificate on file with the state of design, which in this case is with the FAA. So if there is not, then you either have to develop a type certificate for that type, or you have to have it added to an existing type certificate. So to do that, I mean, basically you're looking at reassessing every design factor for the aircraft, the certification exercise. Review every design aspect of the aircraft, the potential forces that an aircraft would be subject to, under what conditions. And then I can't help but think that in a situation like this, you would have to look at bridging the aircraft onto a maintenance program for civilian use. You would have, because the instructions for continuing airworthiness for military might be completely different than what they are for civilian. I mean, if you have to repair bullet holes out in the field, I'm sure that the standard may be a little different. I can't say for certain, but these are all aspects that, you know, every little detail would have to be taken into consideration. It might even be so onerous that it could be more difficult than actually initially type certifying the aircraft.
Mm-hmm. Because in the small experience that I had in the military with the NH90, I remember looking at the maintenance program, and to me it looked like very much like a normal maintenance program. I mean, with specific tasks, because the helicopter had specific equipment. So, but it looks like a normal maintenance program. But in a case like this, again, because we don't know the forces and the loads that the helicopter went through its life, I can see the maintenance program be adjusted in a very serious way, because, you know, maybe, you know, cut some intervals half, or, you know, whatever, you know, because you don't know when a crack can develop, because obviously, because the loads and the forces were different, now a crack can develop earlier than in a civilian case, right?
Right, and there's definitely all of that. But something else that came to mind is, you know, we had a conversation with our friend Adam Backhouse about special conditions. So there may be some novel technologies incorporated into military aircraft, for instance, maybe different flight instruments, maybe different, you know, EFIS systems, whatever the case might be, that aren't even covered under a civilian standard. So those would either have to become special conditions in the type certificate, associated with the type certificate, or they would have to be removed and replaced with something that is of a design standard that's acceptable, you know. So, I mean, there's so many different aspects to it. This is why it becomes almost cost prohibitive. I've got one more example of another type that has been actually fairly successful, but again, it's a different story altogether with type certification and the type certificate holder and such. And this is the Convair. The commercial designation for the aircraft is the Convair 5800. It's a large turboprop aircraft where they take the ex-military type. It was a C-131F, which is a Samaritan, I believe it was called, and the U.S. military used them, and for submarine hunting, I believe is what they were used for originally. The original aircraft was a Convair 340, Convair 440, and Convair 640 were all covered under the original type. Basically, the 340 and 440 are piston type aircraft. The 640 had Dart engines on them. But the type certificate holder for the aircraft the type certificate was sold to an organization, Kelowna Flightcraft. Kelowna Flightcraft has their own design approval organization, so they have the resources in-house They owned the rights to the type. And so what they did is the history of the 340, 440, 640 is they can be converted into what's referred to as a 580, and that's done through different supplemental type certificates. Now this is for the civilian type. When you get to the military type, on the military type, what they've done is they've chosen to use ex-military aircraft as airframes to build a 5800. So a 5800 is a 340 or a 440 piston type aircraft that has a number of STCs embodied in it, which change the propeller and change the engines to Allison turbine engines. And the 5800 is another STC that goes one step further, and they actually stretch the aircraft by 14 feet 3 inches, roughly 7 feet forward of the wing and 7 feet after the wing. And I've actually worked for this company when they were in the middle of doing it. It's quite interesting because you've got an airplane sitting in the hangar, literally cut in 3 pieces. And they stretch it, and then they put pieces of fuselage in the center. But of course, in doing this, I mean, there's a lot of engineering that goes into it, right? They pull all of the plumbing, all of the wiring, everything, all the hydraulics, everything comes out. All of the avionics come out. There's another STC for the avionics package. And when they're done, they end up with a stretched version of this 340 or 440 that's turbine powered. So it's no longer a 580, or it would have been a 580, but they stretched it so under another STC. So now it becomes a 5800. In the process, they've included in the type certificate, they've done the assessment to convert the ex-military aircraft, the Samaritan, into the civilian version, which of course, in doing all of these modifications, they would have gone through it literally tip to tail and did every possible inspection and assessment necessary to meet the certification basis. And in the end, they end up with supplemental type certificate that calls it this aircraft. And part of that is the conversion from military to civilian. And they, in that type certificate, in the STC, they actually designate the master drawing that defines what needs to be done to change it from military to civilian. So again, you can well imagine this is a huge, monumental exercise. And they went through the process, they did it. It was a very interesting, very successful aircraft. But another interesting note, now this one here, because there was a civilian type, and because they did an assessment on, or they included in the type certificate the assessment on what it takes to take it from ex-military to civilian, it can be used in civilian use for anything. I mean, but interestingly, the STC for the stretch, as they call it, has comments that it cannot be used for passenger or cargo use until such time as other STCs are embodied. And when I read that, it came to mind that it seems to me that we ended up with an airplane with a completely empty fuselage, but you could fly it. It was eligible for a certificate of airworthiness, but you couldn't put passengers or cargo in it. The reason being, you needed a separate STC for the equipment, for the cargo loading equipment. These aircraft were used for cargo configuration. So, of course, you need all of the floor tracks, the hold downs, the rollers, everything that go with it. And that all became part of another STC that would be embodied. And now the aircraft is roll ready for something, right? But there's so many different attributes, aspects that you have to take into consideration that it's monumental. It's a very difficult challenge. I don't know. I mean, if you got a lot of money and you're up to it and you got it set in your mind, I guess. But otherwise, there are a lot simpler ways to do things in life.
So I'm curious. Did they have a version where they could fly passengers or just cargo?
I'm not aware. They may have. I'm not aware of a 5800 that is in passenger configuration.
Okay.
Because part of the 58, if my memory serves me right, part of the 5800 conversion was also take out all the passenger windows, because the intent was they would use it for cargo. It's a big rabbit hole, and these rabbit holes, they get very expensive the deeper you go.
Oh, I bet. It's a fascinating topic, though. I like the idea that you can use a military aircraft in the civil, but I can see how it's going to be extremely demanding, because I can imagine just strip it down everything and do, like you said, STCs for the avionics or whatever other, package for the reviewing the entire configuration, because and the maintenance program, that would be a big deal.
Oh yeah, every aspect of it would have to be gone through, and I mean, in the case of something that's relatively recent, like the 412, as opposed to the as opposed to the 5800 or the Blackhawk. And see, another thing about the Blackhawk, for instance, is, again, they're still in production, and so different aspects may be protected by the military, and you can't get that information. So that complicates things even further, or at least it could, right?
Right. Yeah, very interesting topic. It would be nice if we can find somebody who has this particular topic, who is an expert in this particular topic, and do maybe a podcast episode. I think it would be very cool to review the certification aspects.
Yeah, I'm sure it would be. We'll have to talk to our friend Adam, see if he knows somebody that might have some insight on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Bret, thank you again for bringing this topic to our attention. It was very, very interesting. I know there is much more that could be said, but we try to keep our episode short. So thank you very much, everybody, to stay with us and to watch this episode. If you enjoyed, please like, share, and subscribe. And see you next time. Thank you very much. Bye.